Marcus had always dreamed of a quiet life, and after years of serving as a Navy SEAL, he finally found the peace he had longed for. He moved to a small suburban neighborhood, nestled far from the chaos of the city, hoping for a fresh start. The streets were lined with well-kept homes, and the people seemed friendly enough. It was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, and everyone knew everyone else's name. The perfect place for Marcus to relax, enjoy his days, and maybe even begin a new chapter of his life. His house was everything he had hoped for, a cozy home with a small garden and a garage large enough for his car and a few extra things. The walls were freshly painted and the hardwood floors creaked in the most comforting way. Inside, everything was neatly arranged, and Marcus felt a sense of contentment wash over him every time he stepped through the front door. The world outside was hectic and full of noise, but here, in this peaceful neighborhood, it felt like he could finally catch his breath. Marcus had always been a man who preferred solitude. The SEALs had taught him to be independent, resourceful, and strong. His time in the military had shaped who he was, and though he had left that life behind, the discipline and strength he had gained remained with him. He had spent years following orders, being part of a team, and facing dangers that most people would never understand. But now, in his new home, there were no orders to follow, no missions to complete, just the peaceful rhythm of his everyday life. It was on one seemingly ordinary afternoon that everything changed. Marcus was in his living room, sipping coffee and reading a book, when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone, so he was a bit surprised. He put his book down, stood up, and walked toward the door. He looked through the peephole, and 2 men stood outside. Both were dressed in formal clothing, looking like they were on official business. Marcus opened the door slowly, his instinct telling him to be cautious. The man standing in front of him smiled politely, but there was something about his demeanor that didn't sit right with Marcus. He didn't recognize these men, and they didn't seem like neighbors. "Good afternoon, sir," one of the men said, extending a hand. "We're with the HOA, the Homeowners Association. We need to speak with you regarding your property." Marcus shook the man's hand, still trying to figure out what they wanted. "What about my property?" he asked, a bit wary. "Well, sir," the other man chimed in, "we've noticed that you have firearms on your property, and according to the HOA's rules, that's not allowed." Marcus frowned. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've read the neighborhood rules and I don't recall anything about firearms." The man nodded. "Yes, well, it's a newer regulation. The HOA board recently decided that no, guns should be kept in the neighborhood for the safety of all residents. We're here to collect any firearms you might have." Marcus's instincts flared. This was odd. He had never heard of any rule like that. And something about the men's confident demeanor made him suspicious. He was a former Navy SEAL, and over the years, he had learned to trust his gut. These men didn't seem to have the authority they claimed to have. "I'm sorry, but I'm not handing over any of my firearms without seeing some sort of written notice or proof that this is a rule," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I've been here for a while now, and I've never received any notice about this new rule." The 2 men exchanged glances, and Marcus could see that they were growing more uncomfortable. The one who had been speaking earlier looked down at the ground for a moment, then back up at Marcus. "We don't have the paperwork with us, but we have been authorized by the HOA to handle this. You can check with them if you like, but we need to take possession of the guns immediately." Marcus crossed his arms, still standing in the doorway. "I'm not handing over anything until I see some proof that this is a legitimate request. You can leave your contact information and I'll follow up with the HOA myself." The men's faces hardened. The polite smile disappeared, replaced by an expression that bordered on annoyance. "This is non-negotiable, sir," the first man said. "If you refuse, we'll have to escalate the situation." Marcus didn't flinch. He had dealt with far more dangerous situations during his time in the military, and this was nothing more than a game of intimidation. He wasn't going to back down. "Escalate it all you want," he replied calmly, "but I'm not handing over anything without proof." At that moment, the second man stepped forward, trying to push past Marcus into the house. Marcus immediately moved, blocking his path. "That's far enough," he said sternly. The man paused, and Marcus could see the realization dawn on him that he wasn't dealing with an ordinary homeowner. The first man stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, his voice colder now. Marcus smiled slightly. "No," he said, "I don't think I do. But I know you're not who you say you are." The two men froze, realizing they had made a serious mistake. Marcus was no ordinary resident. He had been trained to read people, to understand when something didn't add up, and most importantly, to stay calm under pressure. He had been in situations where life and death were on the line, but this wasn't one of them. This was just a couple of men trying to pull off a scam, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. "I'm calling the police," Marcus said. He stepped back into the house, leaving the door slightly ajar so they could see the phone in his hand. As he dialed, the two men looked at each other and then at Marcus, realizing their bluff had been called. As Marcus spoke with the dispatcher, the men turned and started walking away, but Marcus wasn't done yet. He made sure they heard him. "You should probably run along and think about what happens next," he called after them. "I'll be sure to make sure the authorities know exactly who you are." Marcus hung up the phone and leaned against the doorframe, his heart rate steady. He wasn't concerned. He had already outsmarted them. Now it was time to make sure they didn't hurt anyone else. "Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or further expansion." The two men, caught off guard by Marcus's calm yet firm response, quickly realized their plans were falling apart. They hesitated for a moment, standing still in front of the house, unsure of how to proceed. Marcus could see the tension in their eyes as they exchanged quick glances. One of the men took a step back, his posture stiff and guarded, while the other fidgeted with his shirt sleeve, clearly nervous. It was obvious they hadn't anticipated someone who would stand his ground. They had expected an easy win, a quick grab of Marcus's firearms without much resistance. But they hadn't accounted for the man standing in front of them. Marcus stood tall in the doorway, his calm demeanor belying the sharp focus in his mind. He could hear the faint rustling of wind through the trees, but everything else seemed muted. His instincts were fully engaged, his military training making him acutely aware of the men's movements and the situation unfolding. He wasn't just protecting his property. He was protecting himself and the peace he had fought so hard to create in this quiet neighborhood. The first man, the one who had been speaking most of the time, cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir," he said, his voice now strained, "we understand your concerns, but this is a matter of the community's safety. You can't just ignore HOA regulations." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I've read the HOA guidelines, and nowhere does it say anything about confiscating weapons. So unless you've got something more than words, I think it's time for you to leave." The second man stepped forward again, this time more confidently, but Marcus didn't budge. There was a shift in the air, a kind of quiet before the storm. The man's tone grew more forceful. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't a request. It's an order. Hand them over or there will be consequences." Marcus remained still, his expression unreadable. Inside, he was calculating the next steps. His training had taught him how to handle situations with a calm mind, whether it was in the heat of battle or dealing with an unworthy challenge like this one. He wasn't intimidated. These men were bluffing, and he wasn't about to let them play their game. He glanced over at his phone, still held loosely in his hand. His calm composure seemed to have unnerved the two men. They were no longer certain of what they had planned. They had expected a frightened homeowner, perhaps someone who didn't know their rights, someone who would fold under pressure. But Marcus wasn't that man. His years of service had taught him how to deal with pressure, how to remain unshaken even in the most intense situations. The first man, who had been doing all the talking, seemed to sense that he was losing control of the situation. He took a step back, his eyes darting toward the street, looking for an escape route. But Marcus knew that would only make things worse. He wasn't about to let them leave without facing the consequences of their actions. "You're trespassing," Marcus said, his voice firm but calm. "And you're also impersonating officials. That's a crime. Now I suggest you leave before things get more complicated." The second man seemed to hesitate for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. He looked back at his partner, who appeared uncertain, perhaps even scared. They had underestimated Marcus, thinking that they could pull off their scheme, without much resistance. But Marcus wasn't someone they could push around. He had faced far greater challenges, and this was no different. Marcus kept his gaze steady, not backing down an inch. His calmness was the last thing the two men expected. They wanted fear, but instead they were met with resolve. They began to realize that their plan had gone horribly wrong. It was only a matter of time before the authorities arrived, and they would have no excuse for their actions. The first man muttered something under his breath, and the second man gave him a quick, frustrated glance. "We can't do this," the second man said, his voice quieter now. "Let's just go." Marcus's hand still rested on his phone, his eyes never leaving the two men. "I'm calling the police," he said, not moving an inch. "I don't think you'll be able to talk your way out of this one." At that, the men exchanged one final glance, and with no more words, they turned and began to walk away from the house. But as they left, Marcus wasn't fooled. He knew they weren't just giving up. They were regrouping, thinking of a new way to handle the situation. Marcus stepped back into the house and locked the door behind him. He didn't need to watch them leave. He knew they wouldn't be coming back, at least not without some serious consequences. He could feel the adrenaline from the confrontation slowly ebbing away, leaving him with only the weight of what had just happened. He sat down at the kitchen table, taking a few deep breaths, his mind still sharp and focused. It wasn't just about his firearms. It was about something more important, his peace of mind, his right to live freely without fear or intimidation. He had fought for that peace in ways most people would never understand, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. His phone buzzed on the table, and Marcus quickly picked it up. It was the police. He had already told them the situation, but now it was time for them to take over. As he spoke with the officer on the other end, Marcus remained calm, explaining exactly what had happened. He gave a detailed description of the two men and their actions, making sure that everything was documented. The officer assured Marcus that they would take care of the situation, but Marcus knew that he had to remain vigilant. There would be no more surprises today. The next time these men tried something like this, they would be prepared for the consequences. Marcus ended the call and leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to process everything that had just occurred. He knew that it wasn't over yet, but for now he had won, and that was enough to restore his peace, for now. Let me know if you need any more adjustments or if you'd like to continue with the next parts. Marcus stood by his door, the weight of the situation settling into his bones. He could still feel the tension in the air, thick and unspoken, like a storm waiting to break. Those two men had come to his doorstep with false authority, trying to intimidate him into surrendering something that was his by right. But they had underestimated him. He had learned to stay calm in high-pressure situations, to read people and threats, and to act when necessary. He leaned against the doorframe for a moment, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about a couple of men showing up at his door. It was about more than that. It was about what they represented, their attempt to bully and force someone into submission, to take advantage of his quiet life and his military background. Marcus wasn't going to let that slide. Not in this quiet neighborhood, and certainly not when it came to his right to protect himself and his property. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became, not at the two men themselves, but at the audacity of it all. They had tried to steal from him, not just his firearms, but his sense of safety and control. And the worst part was, they had counted on his fear, on his confusion, on him not knowing his rights. But Marcus knew better. He knew how to stand up for himself no matter what. He grabbed his phone again, making sure to check the number of the police dispatcher he had spoken to earlier. He wasn't about to let the situation slip through the cracks. Marcus had been in far worse situations, but this one felt personal, as if it were a test, and he would not fail it. As he waited for the authorities to arrive, his thoughts kept returning to the two men, how they had acted with such confidence, how they had spoken as if they were above the law. But what they hadn't counted on was that Marcus had a deep understanding of authority. He wasn't someone who could be intimidated, no matter how official their uniforms or smooth their words. And that realization made him feel even more in control. Minutes passed like hours. Marcus kept his eyes on the window, scanning the street for any sign of the men returning. He had dealt with threats before, but this felt different. It wasn't just the potential for danger. It was the realization that sometimes the people you least expect can be the ones trying to deceive you. The sound of sirens finally broke the silence, and Marcus felt his shoulders relax. The police were here. He had done his part, and now it was time to let the professionals handle it. He opened the door and stepped outside, where 2 police cruisers were parked on the street. Officers were already approaching, and Marcus gave a nod to the officer in charge. "I'm Officer Davis," the officer said, holding out his hand. "I understand you've had an issue with 2 men claiming to be HOA officers?" Marcus shook the officer's hand, his voice steady. "Yes, sir. They showed up, claiming I had to hand over my firearms because of some HOA rule I've never heard of. They couldn't provide any proof, and when I asked for documentation, they got more aggressive. I think they were trying to intimidate me into giving them my weapons." The officer listened carefully, nodding as Marcus spoke. He glanced at the houses around them, taking in the peaceful suburban atmosphere. Nothing about this neighborhood suggested any threat. "So you've got no idea why they targeted you?" Officer Davis asked. Marcus shook his head. "No idea at all. They seemed to think they could take advantage of me, but they were wrong." Officer Davis made a note in his notebook, his face serious. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Mr. Lawrence. I'm going to need you to tell me exactly what happened. Any details you can provide will help us track these men down." Marcus took a deep breath, recounting the entire interaction from the moment the men arrived on his doorstep to when they left. He explained their behavior, how they had tried to make him feel small, how they had pressured him to hand over his firearms without any legal justification. The officer listened intently, taking down every detail. When Marcus was finished, Officer Davis looked up, his expression stern but understanding. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Lawrence. I know this must have been unsettling, but we'll take it from here," Officer Davis said, giving him a reassuring smile. "Thank you, officer," Marcus replied, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had done what he needed to do. The rest was now in the hands of the police. The officers began their investigation, speaking to neighbors and checking the area for any security footage that might help identify the imposters. Marcus watched from his porch, trying to piece together what had just happened. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became, not just at the men who had tried to deceive him, but at the larger issue they represented. The idea that people thought they could just show up and take what wasn't theirs. He wasn't naive. He knew there were people out there who would try to take advantage of others. But in his mind, that wasn't going to happen. Not on his watch. Marcus had learned long ago how to face challenges head-on, to stand firm no matter what. It was part of the training he had received during his years as a SEAL, and it was something he would continue to carry with him for the rest of his life. As the police officers worked, Marcus found himself reflecting on the neighborhood he had moved to. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. The neighbors were friendly, and the sense of community was strong. He had chosen this place for a reason, a place where he could enjoy the quiet, where he could put down roots and build a life without the constant noise of the world around him. But even in a peaceful neighborhood, things could go wrong. He had learned that today. But Marcus wasn't going to let this event define him or the life he was building here. He would not let these 2 men shake his sense of security. He had faced worse, and he had always come out stronger. It wasn't just about the guns. It wasn't just about the fake HOA officers trying to take something from him. It was about something deeper, something more important. It was about standing up for what was right, about defending the peace and safety that he had fought for. Marcus wasn't going to back down. And as the police continued their investigation, he felt more confident than ever that this neighborhood, his home, would remain the place of peace he had dreamed of. He went back inside, feeling a sense of satisfaction. The world was unpredictable, and he knew this wouldn't be the last challenge he'd face. But whatever came next, Marcus would be ready. Let me know if you need any further revisions or if you'd like to continue with the next. As the hours passed, Marcus couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering uncertainty. The police were still at the scene, gathering their information and speaking to the neighbors. Marcus had done what he could, but a small part of him still wondered whether the two men might return. They had been bold, and who knew how far their deception had gone. Maybe they had tried this trick on other people in the neighborhood or even in other areas. The thought made him uneasy, but he quickly shook it off. He had stood his ground. He had done what was right. He decided to step inside for a while, needing to clear his mind. The adrenaline from earlier had faded, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion. Marcus didn't like to sit still for long, but the whole situation had left him a bit shaken. He grabbed a glass of water and sat by the window, looking out into the yard. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street, and the soft orange glow in the sky brought a sense of calm. This was the kind of evening he had imagined when he first moved into this house, the quiet, peaceful end to a long day. But today hadn't been peaceful, not at all. His phone buzzed, on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Officer Davis, and Marcus's stomach tightened slightly. He answered the call quickly, trying not to let the tension show in his voice. "Hello, Mr. Lawrence?" The officer's voice came through the phone, sounding calm and steady. "I just wanted to update you on the situation. We've managed to track down the two men who showed up at your house. We've got them in custody, and they're being questioned as we speak." Marcus sat up straighter, a small sense of relief washing over him. "So they were part of something bigger?" he asked, his voice a bit more guarded now. "We think so," Officer Davis replied. "It seems these men were operating in a group. They've been going from neighborhood to neighborhood using the same trick, posing as HOA officers and attempting to confiscate firearms. We've heard reports from a few other residents who had similar encounters. We'll be looking into their records and seeing if they have any other connections." Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It wasn't just about him anymore. These men had been going around, trying to deceive people and take advantage of them. He hadn't been the first target, and he wouldn't be the last if the police didn't step in. "I'm glad to hear they're in custody," Marcus said. "But I'm also worried. If they've been doing this in other neighborhoods, how many people have they tricked?" "We're still investigating, but we're working to make sure we find out exactly how far this goes," Officer Davis reassured him. "We'll be following up with anyone who might have been affected by this, and we'll keep you updated as things progress." Marcus nodded, even though the officer couldn't see him. He felt a sense of justice, but also a lingering unease. The idea that these men had been running this scam for who knows how long made him sick. How many people had trusted them? How many had handed over their firearms, unaware that they were being scammed? It wasn't just about weapons, it was about trust, about safety. And those men had broken that trust. The officer's voice brought him back to the conversation. "I just want to thank you again for handling this situation as well as you did, Mr. Lawrence. Most people would have panicked, but you stood your ground, and that's not something we see every day." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond to that. He wasn't looking for praise. He had done what anyone would have done. He'd been trained to think under pressure, to keep a cool head in the most dangerous situations. But here, in his home, with those men at his door, it was about more than training. It was about protecting what was his and not letting anyone take that away from him. "You're welcome," Marcus said simply. "I'm just glad I could help stop whatever they were trying to do." Officer Davis agreed, and they wrapped up the conversation. Marcus sat back in his chair, feeling a bit lighter than before. The situation wasn't fully resolved, but things were moving in the right direction. He had done what he could, and now it was time for the law to take its course. He looked out the window again, noticing that the last rays of sunlight were fading, leaving behind a darkening sky. The neighborhood seemed peaceful once more, but the events of the day had left their mark. It wasn't just about the guns or the men who had tried to take them. It was about something bigger, a reminder of how quickly things could change. A reminder that there were people out there who would take advantage of others, who would prey on their fear or ignorance. Marcus had been prepared for this, but most people weren't. Most people would have believed the two men, would have handed over their weapons without question. That was a sobering thought. He couldn't help but wonder how many other people in his community had been fooled by these imposters. How many had felt the same fear, the same pressure that Marcus had experienced. Earlier, the feeling that your safety was being threatened, that someone was trying to take control of your life without you having any say in the matter. Marcus knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about the trust that people had in their communities, in the rules that were supposed to keep them safe. When that trust was broken, it could shake everything to its core. He had learned that the hard way, but he also knew that the people in this neighborhood, the ones who had welcomed him here, would stand together to protect each other. They wouldn't let anyone take that from them. As he sat in the quiet of his home, Marcus realized that today had taught him something important. It had shown him the strength of his own resolve, but it had also reminded him of the power of community. Together, people could face anything, even the most unexpected threats. And as long as he lived here, he would do his part to protect that bond, to make sure his neighbors felt safe and secure. The day had been long, but the night was peaceful. Marcus went to bed that evening feeling a little more at ease, knowing that the worst was behind him. But he also knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. Because in the end, that's what it came down to. Being ready, standing firm, and never letting anyone take away the peace you fought so hard to find. Let me know if you'd like any more revisions or need further expansion. The following days passed with a strange sense of normalcy returning to Marcus's life. The sun still rose each morning, the birds still chirped in the trees, and the neighborhood continued to move along with its usual rhythm. But for Marcus, nothing felt the same. What had happened wasn't something you just forget about. The sense of violation, the feeling that someone had tried to take control of his life, lingered. It had been a reminder of how easily things could go wrong, how a peaceful life could be disrupted in an instant. But it had also been a reminder of who he was, what he had learned over the years, and why he had chosen this path. The police had kept him updated, filling him in on the investigation. The two men who had tried to intimidate him were indeed part of a larger scam operation. The authorities had tracked down their connections and discovered that the men were working with a network of criminals who had been targeting unsuspecting homeowners across the region. They had used fake credentials, impersonating HOA officers and claiming that the residents had violated non-existent rules about firearms. The goal was always the same: to intimidate the homeowner into handing over their weapons or other valuables. As Marcus listened to the updates, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It wasn't just about the guns or the violation of his privacy. It was the realization that this kind of thing could happen to anyone. People went about their daily lives, trusting the world around them, not knowing that there were those who would take advantage of that trust. Marcus wasn't one to live in fear, but he understood the importance of awareness. He had always been prepared for physical threats, but this had been different. It was a mental game, a test of his resolve and his ability to see through deception, and in a way, it was a reminder of why he had chosen to leave behind his old life. He sat on his porch one evening, enjoying the cool breeze that had begun to replace the oppressive heat of the day. The neighborhood was quiet, just as it always was. But now Marcus found himself watching more closely, observing the small details that others might overlook. The way the wind rustled the leaves, the movement of people in their yards, the sounds of distant laughter. All of it was part of the life he had fought to protect, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away from him. As he sat there lost in thought, a car pulled up to the curb. It was a sleek black sedan, its windows tinted, making it hard to see who was inside. Marcus's instincts flared, but he didn't move. He had learned to trust his gut, and something about the car felt out of place. The vehicle stopped in front of a house further down the street, and a man stepped out, adjusting his jacket as he walked toward the front door. Marcus watched for a moment longer before reaching for his phone. He dialed Officer Davis's number, the number he had kept handy since the incident. It wasn't that he expected anything unusual, but after what had happened, he wasn't taking any chances. He wasn't the kind of man to wait for things to escalate. "Officer Davis," came the voice on the other end. "Hey, it's Marcus Lawrence," Marcus said, his voice calm but with a hint of concern. "I just saw something that caught my attention. A car pulled up to one of the houses down the street. I'm not sure if it's anything, but I thought I'd mention it." Officer Davis was quick to respond. "Thanks for keeping an eye out. Mr. Lawrence, you're doing the right thing. Can you give me a description of the car?" Marcus didn't hesitate. He described the car in as much detail as he could. The sleek black sedan, the tinted windows, and the man who had gotten out and walked to the door. It was nothing overtly suspicious, but after what had happened, Marcus knew that vigilance was important. "Got it," Officer Davis replied. "We'll send someone over to check it out. It's better to be safe than sorry." Marcus hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, still watching the house. There was something about it that didn't sit right with him, but he wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was just his mind working overtime, but after the events of the past few days, he wasn't going to ignore his instincts. The minutes stretched on, and Marcus kept his eyes trained on the scene. The man who had gotten out of the car was now standing at the door of the house knocking. A woman answered, and they exchanged words that Marcus couldn't hear from this distance. The man handed her something, a piece of paper maybe, or a folder. After a brief conversation, he turned and walked back to his car, getting in and driving away. Marcus felt a strange sense of relief, but also a lingering doubt. Was it just an ordinary exchange, or was something else going on? He couldn't shake the feeling that the man had been up to something, but he couldn't quite place why. About 20 minutes later, Officer Davis called back. "We checked out the situation, Mr. Lawrence," the officer said. "It was just a solicitor, nothing suspicious. But I want to thank you again for staying vigilant. In this line of work, we appreciate people like you who are willing to speak up and keep an eye on things." Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It was nothing. Just an ordinary solicitor, nothing to worry about. But still, his instincts had been right to trust his gut. He knew that sometimes, even the smallest things could be the most telling. "I appreciate the follow-up," Marcus said, "and I'll keep watching." The officer chuckled. "That's exactly what we need. Thanks again, Mr. Lawrence." As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that he had found something he hadn't expected when he first moved into this neighborhood. He had found a purpose. It wasn't just about protecting his own home, his own peace. It was about looking out for the people around him. This wasn't just his fight. It was the fight of the entire neighborhood. He wasn't just a man living in a house. He was part of a community. And as long as he was here, he would do his part to protect that community. The days that followed felt different. He wasn't just the quiet man in the corner house anymore. He was someone people respected, someone they knew would stand up for what was right. He had become the kind of neighbor who others could rely on, and that sense of belonging, of knowing that he had a place in this world, gave him a deep sense of peace. The situation with the fake HOA officers had been unsettling, but it had also been a wake-up call. It had reminded him of how fragile things could be and how important it was to protect what you had. The world wasn't always going to be kind, but as long as Marcus had his resolve, as long as he had his integrity, he knew he could face whatever came his way. And so, Marcus continued to live his life in this quiet neighborhood, keeping a watchful eye not just for himself but for the people who had come to trust him. His story had only just begun, but in a way it had already taught him the most important lesson of all. That strength wasn't just about being tough, it was about knowing when to stand tall and when to protect what you loved.